It was just another ordinary morning on the subway. The train was crowded, and people were either buried in their phones or staring off into space, completely detached from their surroundings. Amidst all the hustle, an elderly woman, slowly and carefully, stepped onto the train, clutching her handbag tightly. She looked around for a seat, her steps measured but deliberate. Her face was kind, yet there was a weariness in her eyes, as if life had taught her to be resilient in ways others couldn't even imagine. As she scanned the seats, her eyes landed on one young man sitting comfortably in the middle. His feet were sprawled across the seat opposite him, and he was wearing large headphones, bobbing his head to music with a cocky air, completely oblivious to anyone around him. The space next to him was unoccupied, but there was no sign that he had any intention of giving up his spot. The elderly woman took a step forward, the weight of her tired legs making her hesitant. She cleared her throat gently, hoping for some acknowledgement, but the young man didn't even flinch. She moved closer, standing just beside him, waiting for him to at least offer a simple gesture of politeness. But instead of moving his feet or offering his seat, he glanced up, gave her a smirk, and muttered, "What's wrong, old lady? You're not gonna make me move, are you? You look like you can stand a little longer." The woman didn't say a word, but her eyes narrowed slightly. Her lips remained pressed together, as she resisted the urge to snap back. She had lived too many years to let a disrespectful young man ruin her composure. But she wasn't about to let him off easy either. In one swift motion, she pretended to fumble with her purse and, by accident, dropped an apple onto the floor. It rolled right under the young man's feet. He looked down and scoffed, "Really? Clumsy much?" He leaned back in his seat, chuckling to himself, seemingly proud of his snide remark. The woman bent down slowly to pick up the apple, keeping her back straight despite the pain that clearly tugged at her joints. As she picked it up, her fingers brushed against the young man's shoes. He immediately shoved his elbow out, making sure to accidentally knock her arm, sending a sharp jolt of pain through her body. A small gasp escaped her lips, but she said nothing. The crowd remained silent, too afraid to intervene. Most simply stared at their phones, pretending not to see the scene unfold, while a few others shifted uneasily, unwilling to get involved. But the woman, though clearly hurt, did not react with anger. Her face remained calm, but there was a flicker of determination in her eyes. She wasn't going to let this go. Her fingers tightened around her purse, a subtle sign that she was preparing for what would come next. She straightened up, her back as stiff as ever, and her gaze, still fixed on the young man, conveyed something far more powerful than words could. She wasn't just a frail old woman, she was someone who had weathered storms and was more than capable of standing her ground. She was about to show this young man that respect wasn't something you could mock and get away with. The noise of the subway was deafening, the train's usual screech and rumble blending with the hum of the passengers' restless murmurs. Inside the train car, the uncomfortable silence between the elderly woman and the young man had stretched longer than anyone cared to admit. She stood there, fragile and weary, holding onto the overhead bar with a steady grip, while the young man slouched in his seat, his eyes fixed lazily on his phone. The woman's gaze flicked nervously over the crowd, unsure of how to handle the situation. She could feel the tension building up, her feet were sore, and the constant movement of the train made it hard to balance. Her back ached, and the stares from the other passengers felt heavier with every passing second. The young man, not once breaking his smirk, had been purposely ignoring her for what felt like an eternity, his posture sprawled arrogantly across the seat. He had no intention of offering his seat to her, nor was he moved by her subtle, silent plea. Suddenly, she felt a sharp shove against her side. It wasn't a hard push, but the young man had knocked into her, sending a brief but painful shock of discomfort through her body. She winced, but said nothing. Her hand tightened on the bar, trying to regain balance. The apple she had been holding in her bag slipped out, rolling onto the floor with a small, soft thud. The young man let out a chuckle, eyes flicking to the fallen fruit. "Oops," he muttered under his breath, clearly unconcerned. The others in the car looked away, unwilling to intervene. Some pretended to check their phones, others stared straight ahead. The elderly woman's face flushed with both anger and humiliation, but she didn't say a word. She was used to being invisible in these kinds of situations. As she bent down to pick up the apple, her hand trembled slightly, a mix of frustration and embarrassment gnawing at her. At that moment, the atmosphere in the subway car shifted. A calm, steady voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, son," came the deep, gravelly voice from the back of the car. The young man looked up, narrowing his eyes in annoyance. He had hoped the man would be some weak old guy who would back down quickly. But as his eyes adjusted, they widened. Standing in front of him was a man who, despite being older, exuded an aura of power and composure that couldn't be ignored. The man wore a black cowboy hat, which cast a shadow over his face, making it hard to immediately discern his age, but the way he carried himself, his broad shoulders, the deliberate way he stood, told the young man that this was no ordinary person. His jeans were simple, his shirt unremarkable, but there was a quiet force about him that immediately commanded attention. The young man sneered, his lips curling into a smirk. "What do you want, old man?" His tone was dismissive, but a small seed of doubt planted itself in the back of his mind. He had dealt with troublemakers before, but something about this man felt different. The stranger's eyes locked on his, calm and unwavering. There was no aggression in his posture, just a promise of something far more menacing than simple confrontation. "You owe this lady an apology," the man said, his voice unwavering, each word measured. "And while you're at it, you can pick up that apple you knocked down." For a second, the young man froze. His brain tried to process the request. Apologize? To this old guy? His mouth opened to retort, but nothing came out immediately. The tone in the man's voice was firm, yet calm, and that unsettled him. He had expected to intimidate or brush off anyone who intervened, but this man wasn't reacting the way he expected. He glanced over at the elderly woman, whose face was pale but composed. She seemed to have faith in the stranger's words, even though her body was clearly tired and strained. He noticed the way she held her ground, not backing down, and something in his chest tightened, a feeling he hadn't anticipated. The young man's pride flared, and he grinned, hoping to regain control of the situation. "Are you serious?" he sneered. "You want me to apologize to her? Why don't you tell her to stand up for herself, huh?" His words cut through the air like a challenge, but the older man didn't flinch. Instead, his eyes remained locked on the young man's, as if he were waiting for something, waiting for the storm to settle before he made his move. "Apologize," Chuck Norris said again, his voice unwavering and even firmer this time, the power of the words making it clear this was not a request but an instruction. The young man hesitated. His bravado had started to waver under the weight of the stranger's presence. He didn't like how it felt, but he refused to back down. He stood up suddenly, attempting to maintain his posture as he squared off against Chuck. "You're just an old man, I'm not scared of you." But the moment his shoulder brushed against Chuck's, something inside him shifted. It wasn't just the physical contact, it was the way Chuck remained completely unfazed. The young man had expected the older man to stumble or even show some sign of weakness, but there was nothing. Just a calm, unbothered stillness that made his chest tighten. The train's sudden lurch brought him back to the present, but his bravado had started to crumble. Something wasn't right. And in that moment, he felt a flicker of doubt. Was this man truly someone he could push around? The air in the subway car had shifted dramatically. What had started as a typical morning commute was now charged with an undeniable tension. The clattering of the train over the tracks felt distant now, replaced by the quiet murmur of nervous energy. Passengers subtly exchanged glances, their eyes flicking between Chuck Norris, who remained calm and composed, and the young man who stood in front of him, puffing out his chest and glaring with a mixture of arrogance and nervousness. The elderly woman, still clutching her handbag tightly in her hands, stood quietly to the side. She could feel the change in the atmosphere, like the pressure before a storm. She was no longer focused on the pain in her back, which had been a dull ache when she was first shoved into the corner. Now, all of her attention was on the strange and escalating confrontation before her. Part of her wanted to flee the scene, to escape to the farthest corner of the train, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was a strange sense of awe at the man who had stood up to protect her. Chuck Norris, on the other hand, remained completely still, almost unnervingly so. He hadn't moved a muscle since standing up from his seat. His posture was relaxed, yet there was an intensity in his gaze that spoke volumes. His body was completely at ease, but every fiber of him was ready. Ready for what, though? The moment was unclear. The young man, trying to assert himself, took a step forward. His feet were planted firmly on the floor, but his stance was shaky. He was trying to project confidence, but the widening eyes of the other passengers were beginning to eat away at his bravado. The reality of the situation was sinking in, the attention from everyone, the stillness of Chuck Norris, and the knowledge that he was, for the first time in his life, facing a man who didn't flinch at his posturing. With a forced sneer, the young man tried to regain control of the moment. "Look, old man," he said loudly, his voice edging on a challenge, "I'm not scared of you. Don't you dare tell me what to do." His voice cracked slightly at the end, a sign that his confidence was starting to unravel, but he quickly covered it up with another exaggerated huff. Chuck didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any words could have been. He simply stood there, letting the tension build. He wasn't trying to intimidate the young man, but it was clear that he was measuring him, analyzing every twitch, every movement. He could feel the nervous energy radiating from the young man, and he knew that this wasn't a fight that required much effort. The young man's bravado faltered, but he quickly recovered, deciding to press the issue. With a sudden motion, he shoved Chuck in the chest, a move meant to provoke. He wanted to show everyone that he could take on this old man, that he was the one in control. But instead of pushing Chuck back, he felt as though he had collided with an immovable object. Chuck didn't flinch. He didn't budge. It was as if his body had absorbed the shove like a stone wall. The young man's breath hitched in his throat. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had been expecting Chuck to stumble, to fall back, to at least show some sign of weakness, but instead, Chuck's chest was as solid as ever. It was as if the force he had exerted on the man had been absorbed by Chuck's unshakable calm. Chuck's gaze remained steady. His face was stoic, his expression unreadable, yet there was a quiet confidence in his eyes. "That was a mistake," Chuck said, his voice low and steady, but it carried an edge of finality. "You don't want to keep going down this path." The young man blinked rapidly, his bravado completely cracking for the first time. He tried to make himself feel bigger, stepping closer, as if that would somehow intimidate Chuck. "What are you gonna do about it, huh? You gonna hit me, old man?" The challenge was clear, but the hesitation in his voice was just as obvious. He was trying to salvage his pride, trying to push back against the realization that this man wasn't afraid of him. And then, it happened, Chuck moved. The motion was so fluid, so quick, that the young man didn't have time to react. Chuck grabbed the young man's wrist with a grip that was like iron, the pressure immediately sending a sharp shock of pain through his arm. With one fluid twist, Chuck flipped the young man's arm behind his back, forcing him into a painful submission hold. The young man's body locked up in an instant, and he let out a shocked yelp, his knees buckling as the pain shot up his arm. His face twisted in agony, but Chuck's grip didn't relent. He didn't need to use any more force than necessary, just enough to get the point across. "Not here. Not today," Chuck repeated, his voice still low, but full of authority. The words were not a threat, they were a statement. The young man wasn't getting away with this. The passengers were frozen, their eyes wide in disbelief. The only sound was the hum of the train, but even that seemed distant as they watched Chuck Norris effortlessly subdue the aggressor. The young man was now completely at Chuck's mercy, the same cocky smirk that had been on his face now replaced by a look of genuine fear. His previous arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the stark realization that he had underestimated the wrong man. Chuck slowly released his grip on the young man's wrist, pushing him back slightly. The young man stumbled, his face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and humiliation. He didn't say another word, but as he backed away, his eyes never left Chuck. There was no more fight left in him. The elderly woman, who had been watching the entire exchange, let out a small sigh of relief, her shoulders dropping as the weight of the situation seemed to lift. She couldn't help but feel a mix of gratitude and awe for Chuck, this stranger who had stepped in and handled the situation with such quiet authority. Chuck turned to her, his face softening. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. She nodded, her words barely above a whisper. "Yes, thank you. I'm fine now. Thank you." Chuck gave her a reassuring smile, and for a moment, the entire subway car seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The young man, still visibly shaken, made his way toward the door, his eyes glued to the floor. No one spoke as he exited, but the passengers' gazes followed him. They had witnessed something they wouldn't forget, an act of courage, of righteous action, that had unfolded right before their eyes. As the train continued its journey, the tension that had filled the air was replaced by a quiet respect. Chuck Norris had shown them all something invaluable that day, not just about bravery, but about standing up for what was right. The tension in the subway car, though momentarily relieved after Chuck's decisive defeat of the first two aggressors, still hung in the air like a thick cloud. The elderly woman, still gripping her purse tightly and trying to gather herself after the assault, slowly began to breathe again, her chest rising and falling with each shaky breath. The passengers around her remained frozen in their seats, some looking at Chuck with awe, others too scared to look him in the eye, all of them quietly processing the astonishing scene that had just unfolded before them. Chuck Norris stood at the center of it all, his posture relaxed, yet still emanating an undeniable aura of power and control. His calmness was almost unsettling, the complete opposite of the chaos that had just erupted. He looked around, taking in the faces of the passengers who were now too frightened or awestruck to even make eye contact. His mind, however, was clear. His only focus was on the elderly woman, ensuring she was safe, though his quiet gaze betrayed a sharp awareness of his surroundings. For a brief moment, it seemed as though everything was over. The subway car, now back in motion, seemed to resume its usual rhythm. The screeching of the metal wheels and the hum of the lights felt strangely distant compared to the explosive confrontation moments ago. The young man who had started it all had been taken down, and the situation appeared to be resolved. But just as the car began to feel like it was returning to normal, a new disturbance erupted from the far end of the train. A third figure emerged, his silhouette dark against the subway lights. The man was tall, wearing a worn leather jacket and carrying a look of sheer malice on his face. He was no bystander trying to restore peace, this man had come with clear intent. His eyes locked onto Chuck with a menacing glint, and it was obvious that he wasn't there to talk. The man's gait was deliberate as he moved closer, his steps heavy, as if he relished the thought of confronting Chuck. He glanced quickly at the woman and the other passengers, his look one of contempt before he focused all his attention on Chuck. It was clear now, he had been watching, waiting for his moment. His hand moved instinctively toward the baton tucked into his jacket, and the moment his fingers wrapped around it, the subway car seemed to freeze. The passengers felt it, the tension mounting again, the quiet before the storm. Some passengers, their eyes wide with fear, leaned back in their seats, others instinctively braced themselves for whatever was about to happen. But Chuck Norris, ever calm, ever aware, was already prepared. The third aggressor's eyes narrowed as he closed the distance between himself and Chuck. Without a word, he brandished the baton and swung it with all his strength at Chuck's head. The sharp crack of the baton slicing through the air was deafening, and for a moment, the entire car held its breath, wondering if this would be the blow that would finally overpower Chuck. But Chuck was already one step ahead. His reflexes, honed through years of training and experience, were like nothing the attacker could have anticipated. In a movement so swift that the human eye could barely follow, Chuck stepped to the side, his body shifting with the fluidity of water. The baton swung harmlessly past him, missing its target by inches, but Chuck's actions were far from over. With almost no effort, Chuck reached out, his arm moving with precision, and seized the man's wrist. The force was gentle but unyielding, a grip like iron. The attacker's eyes widened in surprise, and for the first time, there was hesitation in his movements. Chuck twisted the man's arm with a quick, controlled motion, forcing the baton to fall from his hand. The crowd gasped in unison, their disbelief now turning into awe. The third man stumbled back, his arm now locked behind his back in an unnatural angle. The man's face contorted in pain, and Chuck's eyes remained focused and unwavering. He didn't even break a sweat. There was no emotion in Chuck's gaze, no anger, just cold, calculated precision. This wasn't a fight, it was a lesson, and Chuck was teaching it. The man grunted, trying to struggle against Chuck's grip, but it was futile. Each movement he made only caused more pain, and the force with which Chuck held him didn't waver. He was like a rock in the middle of a storm, unmoved, unshaken. "You don't want to do this," Chuck said, his voice calm but firm. The words weren't a threat, they were simply the truth. The aggressor's expression twisted into a mix of rage and confusion. He tried to pull away, but Chuck's hold was impenetrable. In that moment, Chuck felt no need to justify himself further. He didn't need to prove anything. The lesson had already been delivered. With one last controlled twist, Chuck released the man's arm, sending him staggering backward in a daze. The third aggressor, his pride crushed and his body defeated, took one final look at Chuck, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Without a word, he turned and rushed toward the subway doors, pushing his way through the crowd, eager to escape the humiliation he had just endured. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and the man vanished into the darkness of the subway tunnel. The train car returned to a tense silence, but this time, the atmosphere had shifted. The fear that had gripped the passengers before had been replaced with something else, respect. A kind of reverence. No one spoke, but everyone had witnessed something incredible. Chuck took a moment to glance around the car, his eyes meeting those of the elderly woman once more. She was still sitting there, her hands shaking slightly but her gaze now filled with gratitude. She had been terrified moments ago, but now, she could only look at Chuck in awe. "Are you okay?" Chuck asked gently, his voice much softer now, as though the storm had passed and only calm remained in his wake. The elderly woman nodded slowly, still too stunned to speak. Her lips parted, but it was a moment before she could find her voice. I'm fine. You saved me," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Chuck simply nodded, his expression softening for a moment. "It's no trouble," he replied, his tone even but filled with a quiet sincerity. "No one should have to go through that. No one." With that, he turned and began to move back toward his seat, his posture as composed as ever. The elderly woman watched him go, still unable to fully process what had just transpired. The other passengers, too, seemed lost in their own thoughts, reflecting on what they had just witnessed. As the train sped through the underground tunnel, the sound of the wheels on the tracks was the only noise left in the car. The passengers, once so tense and nervous, were now left with a sense of awe. Chuck Norris hadn't just protected a woman, he had shown them all the true meaning of courage, strength, and dignity. Scene 5. A silent respect after the battle. The subway car falls into odd silence. The moment the third aggressor fled, the entire subway car seemed to exhale in unison. The air, which had been thick with tension and fear, now felt almost suffocatingly quiet. The sharp sounds of Chuck's swift and calculated actions still echoed in the minds of the passengers, but the train itself was silent, as if even the wheels on the track were afraid to disturb the newfound peace. Chuck Norris stood still, his posture as straight and unwavering as a pillar. He didn't need to say a word. The silence surrounding him was louder than any speech. His presence filled the space, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The passengers, still stunned, were frozen in place, their eyes following Chuck's every move. It wasn't just admiration they felt, it was a deep respect, a recognition of something powerful and unspoken. The elderly woman, now free from immediate danger, slowly began to sit up straighter. Her hands, still trembling, clutched her purse tightly, but her expression had softened. There was no more fear in her eyes. Instead, there was gratitude for the man who had stepped in without hesitation, who had defended her without a second thought. She gazed at Chuck as he turned back to his seat, his movements slow and deliberate, as if the confrontation had been just another day for him. The other passengers had been witnessing a scene they could hardly believe. No one had expected that the unassuming, calm man in the cowboy hat would be the one to stand up against such brazen cruelty. But now, as they looked at each other in stunned silence, a wave of realization swept over them. They had just witnessed something extraordinary, an act of pure courage and strength, a lesson in how to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. Chuck, now seated once again, let out a quiet breath. His chest rose and fell slowly, but there was no sign of strain in his face, no evidence of the battle that had just transpired. He didn't need to look around to know what the passengers were thinking. He had been in enough situations like this to know that silence often speaks louder than any applause. His mission was complete, and now all that remained was to ensure that the elderly woman was safe. The passengers slowly started to stir. A few whispered to each other, still processing what they had just seen. Others simply stared at Chuck in awe, their eyes wide with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. It wasn't that they feared him, but there was a profound respect for the quiet, unshakable strength he had displayed. It was a strength that didn't need to prove itself, one that stood firm in the face of violence and didn't back down. The elderly woman finally stood up, her legs a little unsteady, but her movements were more confident now. She approached Chuck slowly, her hands still trembling, but her eyes were no longer filled with fear. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Chuck gave her a simple nod, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were kind. "You don't need to thank me," he replied, his voice calm and steady. "It's just what you do when it's the right thing to do." The train came to a stop at the next station, but no one made a move to get off. The passengers, still too awestruck to speak, continued to sit in their places, as if frozen in time. The doors opened, and a few people trickled off the train, but most stayed behind, unwilling to break the spell that had been cast by Chuck's heroic actions. As the train continued its journey, the car remained eerily quiet, but the atmosphere was different. There was no longer a sense of fear or uncertainty. Instead, there was a shared understanding among the passengers. They had all been a part of something monumental, something they would never forget. The image of Chuck Norris, standing unwavering and resolute in the face of danger, would remain with them long after the train ride was over. For Chuck, however, it was just another day, another moment where he had done what needed to be done, without expectation, without drama. As the train carried on through the underground tunnels, Chuck leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a brief moment, lost in his thoughts. The world outside may have been chaotic, but inside the subway car, for those few precious minutes, there had been a glimpse of something better, something to aspire to. And as the passengers disembarked at the next stop, they left with one thing in common, a deep respect for the man who had, without question, become their silent hero.